if they learn nothing else, I hope they learn that God isn't leaving them alone, that they have an advocate, that Mary does hear their prayers and Mary does intercede on their behalf. And that ultimately, especially in these very strange times, what can seem chaotic, and I don't know what's going to happen on the news from day to day in the United States, but we're not just left to the chaos. Mary is still here. She is advocating for us.
Here we go. Hello and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, Davide Battistella. Find the Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. Today on the Focusing Way podcast, we are exploring Marian apparitions. Earlier this year, I began visiting sites around Italy where there have been apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The visits to these sacred spaces brought me peace and comfort of heart. Whether you've heard about the Blessed Virgin Mary, thought about her, prayed to her, or admired her, you will be fascinated by a new and definitive volume put together by the Sophia Institute Press. The book, The World of Marian Apparitions, documents many of the apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary through the centuries and around the world. The Virgin Mary appears to laity, popes, the poor, and the illiterate to demonstrate her love for humanity. Through the Catholic faith, she is the mediatrix of all graces. Every grace you receive from God comes through her. She's also a messenger who appears and presents great miracles, like the miracle of the sun witnessed by 75,000 mostly non-believers in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. And joining me now is Michael Lichens from the Sophia Institute Press. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David, for having me here. It's great to join you and your audience.
I really appreciate it. And let's begin, if you could, just give a little bit of an explanation of how the Catholic Church determines an actual apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
It can be a very long and arduous process, if I'm honest, especially for people who have particular devotions to some of these apparitions. But what happens effectively is it starts at the local level. The bishops, he'll send often a priest who has a background in Marian theology or has a little bit more knowledge. And this will be observed and investigated. Any witnesses will be talked to make sure that they're people who are not prone to lying, people who aren't necessarily suffering from any hallucinations or anything like that. If it makes it through the local level and eventually the bishop allows it for private devotion, that's what we consider approved at the local level. So that's the first step in getting it approved by the church. For it to be universal, for it to be a place of pilgrimage and things like that, that has to go through the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, which was what Pope Benedict was the head of until he became Pope. In earlier years, it was also called the Holy Inquisition. But the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith is the one that will then do major investigative work, going through many of the diaries, any consultations they have to hire. And that can take decades, and I'm talking most of my lifetime with some of these apparitions that are still being investigated for universal application. But even besides that, in the Catholic Church, we don't necessarily say that you have to believe every Marian apparition. This is something that is there approved for your own spiritual development, but it's not something you're forced to believe. So even a big one like Fatima, which every Catholic grandma, I say, would probably pray her rosary for her children and grandchildren to Our Lady, because of Our Lady of Fatima. That's not necessarily something you have to believe, but obviously once it becomes a universal approval and we get approval for things like pilgrimages, this can change the towns forever, and it places it in a bigger part of our imagination and also the larger part of salvation history for us.
Yeah, and I guess I thank you for that answer, because I just wanted to bring some clarity to that,
Mhm.
because it's not a simple process. Sometimes it takes hundreds of years
Yes.
for anyone to have recognized that it happened, and it's something that the church takes very, very seriously. It's not, they don't just say.
Hmm.
There are big investigations around it, and this I learned, of course, in a previous episode with Adam Bly about how diligent the church is when they're establishing what is a miracle. So
Hmm.
and just for another clarity thing, just before we really get into it, I could you just give a small explanation of the various names that are given to Our Lady over the years? Because she kind of takes on the name of the place, or the apparition ends up having a name. Maybe just an overview of that, just in case we hear different names over the course of this of our chat. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Adam Bly, one of your previous guests, he talked about in the introduction to this book that we consider the first Marian apparition to go all the way back in year 40 when when Mary was appearing to St. James. And if I know you've been in Europe, so the Camino de Compostela is one of the great famous pilgrimage routes. Mary, apparently, while she was still alive, appeared to James in that moment, and that's kind of considered the first great Marian apparition. Wasn't fully approved until the 1700s, just to give you an idea how long these things can take. But along with that, of course, she's appeared in many other places. Fatima, I mentioned, which is probably the most famous, the apparition of the 20th century. And this is a old way of identifying saints and miracles and things like that. You would often want to identify them with the town or the chapel where this miracle took place. Saint Michael has a few in Italy as well, where he showed up, and thus the place will get named after him, or it will be Saint Michael of spacing on that chapel out north of Naples. But this
Yeah.
happens, of course, anytime she appears. And what we say when I'm saying like Our Lady of Fatima, Our Lady of Banu, Belgium, or things like that, is I'm referring to a particular apparition, but more importantly, a particular message and a particular emphasis Mary wanted to bring to us in that particular place. And sometimes it could be as small as her apparition in Egypt, which was the silent apparition, where she said practically nothing and just wanted people to know that she was there watching over the various Christians
Uh-huh.
suffering in Egypt.
Yeah.
But other times it's to emphasize in Fatima, it becomes the rosary apparition, because that is her big emphasis, to keep praying, to offer first Saturdays, to offer uh, sacrifices for the world. That World War One just ended. We were about 30 years from the next World War, so it was kind of a warning of the 20th century.
Yeah. But where I'd really like to start for us today is that very notion that Our Lady represents, and that is of the mother and the family. And Our
Mm.
Lady is the mother of God, and the Holy Family is a cornerstone of the Catholic faith. So I'd like to start with Mariamonte's visions in the United States, if we can. And the
Yeah.
reason I want to start there is that these visions that occurred in the US came to this woman whose name we don't know. She's just known as Mariamonte. And Our Lady chose this married mother and emphasized how much a silent and hidden life counts. So, can you just talk a little bit about Mariamonte's visions in the
I would
US?
love to. This is the fun thing about it. This was in Rome City, which is all the way out in Indiana. It seems almost a little too perfect. A place called Rome would have a Marian apparition. But what's also delightful about this for me is it's not. This book covers the last 200 years of apparitions, so it doesn't cover quite the Wisconsin apparition that happened, which was another site where Our Lady of America was known and made her name known. But one of the things, to give you just some background, Our Lady Mary is technically our patron of the United States under the title the Immaculate Conception. That's why if you go to DC, the great Catholic shrine there is the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception.
Hmm.
It's because our bishops in the 1840s, I believe, right after the Civil War, placed the protection of the United States under her. And this was responded to by Marian a couple ways through some smaller apparitions. Rome City is one that even people I know in Indiana, I'd never heard of it maybe till 2 years ago. But she began appearing to someone by the name of Saint Mary Ephraim in the 1950s. I believe the first apparition happened in 1956.
Mm-hmm.
Saint Mary was from Austrian immigrants, as so many of our great Catholic sites are. She but she found a but she had a devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes before that. And so Mary coming in and proclaiming herself to Saint Mary Ephraim initially was was just something that unbelievable for many of us. But she kept showing herself to Saint Mary Ephraim. Even when Mary Ephraim moved from Rome City to Cincinnati or even DC, she was often talking with Mary. Now, what she has often emphasized in this is the continuation of her mission, even from Lourdes. It's an assurance that she is praying for the United States and that under her mantle of the Immaculate Conception, the United States could seek out to her and pray to her. And she told people to pray to her Immaculate Heart for not just daily, but also for any miracles we would need. And again, this is where the title Our Lady of America, meaning we put the United States of America under her mantle, continues on. And this is, we still haven't defined that title for her. That's not a universal title yet, but it's one that's been revealed enough that even cathedrals and our bishops have started to refer to her as Our Lady of America.
Because the phenomenon is global, and as you mentioned, it happens in many countries. And of course, the apparitions at Fatima are among the most famous in history. And there, Our Lady appeared to three poor children, two of
Mm-hmm.
whom became the youngest saints in Catholicism. And the other is Sister Lucia, who was able to both hear and see Our Lady, and also wrote down three very famous secrets dictated to her. So, but what I wanted to talk about was, could you talk a bit about Lucia's life before the famous apparitions when she was a small child?
Mm-hmm.
As it kind of seems to indicate that how Our Lady, through God's grace, seems to prepare the way for Lucia's life, and then later what she would hear and learn about at Fatima, and then carry as a Catholic sister for the rest of her life.
Yeah, she was born to a peasant family in Portugal right at the end of the 19th century. I'm sorry, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century, she was born to a peasant family. They weren't by any means like super poor or anything. They owned land, they had flocks, they were doing pretty well considering the times. But Portugal itself, before right leading to the apparitions, was undergoing a lot of reconstruction. There was, of course, the battles between communism and fascism and all the other horrible ideologies of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Uh, And she was, I want to say she was roughly about, she had just, she had either received the sign of the cross or was about to receive the sign of the cross by the time that she remembered seeing the apparitions when they first began. But before that, she had a very large, she was one of six children, I believe,
Hmm.
very large, very devout Catholic family. Her family did take her to be baptized when she was an infant. Uh, Her catechesis she mostly got from religious sisters and also her family. And of course, and this prepared her for when she would meet initially the angel of Portugal, which was in itself like within Catholic theology and history, because we're taught that angels are even assigned over nations and cities as guardians, much like how we have a guardian angel.
Hmm.
So the fact that an angel calls himself the angel of Portugal is already something very much a big deal in Catholic history. It means that she got to meet one of the guardian angels of a nation.
Yeah.
Uh, then we, then of course the Marian apparitions start with her two cousins, Jacinto and Francisco Marto. Uh, and again, those two are cousins. This isn't too abnormal for a lot of societies. I still know families that live this way where cousins are raised around each other.
Hmm.
Now, gosh, to give the cliff notes of how it all started seems almost too big,
Yeah,
but
it's huge. I mean, I think what I loved is the book went into enough detail to sort of
hmm
describe this uh, very adult young lady who received First Communion at the age of 6. And
yes,
there was a protest against that by the priest who was supposed to administer it, but her local priest had told the bishop, "Look, this girl is catechized better than anybody around." And she was 6 years old at the time. So I just thought it was a beautiful indication that of how Our Lady operates, and the fact that she will grant the graces to the people often many years before they are called.
hmm
So she had no idea why she had this devotion, why she wanted to receive First Communion at such a young age. And all of those graces happened in her life. I love that the book has these kind of beautiful details inside of it like that. And, I just, just talking about that, about sort of preparing the way,
yeah,
Sister Faustina also was visited
hmm
by the Blessed Virgin Mary. So, um, I guess, could you talk a bit about how Our Lady reveals herself and how people are often moved to a religious life, like the experiences that people like Saint Faustina obviously went on to be an incredible
hmm
saint. But could you just talk about, as you looked at the volume, as you were putting it, as you were reviewing it, and
yeah.
yeah, just share
I
some of that. Yeah.
absolutely. So, of course, Sister Lucia, I think she not only got graces before the visions happened, but afterwards they continued on. But even before Lucia did, we talk about these things being global. Something like 20 years in the 1880s, Pope Leo the 13th received a vision himself. This was the one that inspired him to want to write the St. Michael's Prayer because he had a vision of the devil and God having a conversation and the devil being given reign to do what he wanted to the church for a time. And this was a terrifying vision that also was echoed in Our Lady's Fatima visions, where she was warning of a great trial to come to people. Some people thought it was World War II. Some people thought it was communism. I tend to think it was the entirety of the 20th century she was warning us about because of in my heart of hearts, I truly don't know how the human race survived the 20th century. I just look at all the tensions and terrors, and I
Yeah.
do not know how we got through it. But
Yeah.
when it comes down to it, it's like because somebody was watching over us.
Hmm.
And we see that through Mary. She has not only put Saint Sister Lucia, or when she was just the little girl Lucia, in the right place at the right time, she had the Pope in Rome also hearing and receiving visions. So here we are in modernity between the world wars, and there God is still working through his mother to make sure that we are able to stay faithful and maybe survive through the 20th century to continue the human race.
Hmm.
I think there's also, for me, I what I love about all these apparitions, even the silent ones, whether it's Knock in Ireland or Zaytone, Egypt, as I mentioned before, that sometimes it's just silence because anyone who's been through a rough time knows how much just having the presence of a friend, just having someone who loves you and cares about you present, they don't have to talk, they don't have to do anything extraordinary, they just need to be there. And I think Mary understands that at a very personal level, that sometimes we need to be reminded that there's something beyond the grind of everyday life of just working and keeping our heads down and wondering if the governments are going to launch the nukes today or tomorrow. There's
Mm.
more to it. And it's strangely comforting, is the word I would use, to
Yeah.
know that it's still out there and that there's order to the chaos, is the best way I would phrase it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a movement in people's hearts of feeling
Mhm.
loved, of and as you work through the book, you just keep you feel like you're experiencing very, very personal friendships emerging, but they're
Mm-hmm.
being shared for the whole world. I love the story you told about Pope Leo, where, he turned sheet white and immediately, like, practically, I guess, went into an ecstasy for about 10
Mm-hmm.
minutes and immediately dictated this prayer, which then became part of every single mass in all
Mm-hmm.
of Catholicism, which are still said, I believe, in the traditional Latin Mass today. They're called
Yeah.
the Leonine prayers, uh, and to ensure that every single Roman Catholic on earth was praying to defend against this vision that he had seen. So, yeah, it's just so they the the whole thing is full of wonder and awe, and
Mm-hmm.
I just want to move it over to a couple of specific things.
Please.
So, there's a lot about the rosary, right? And we
Yes.
we know that the rosary was given to Saint Dominic by the Blessed Virgin, and he used it to great effect with his Dominican friars to convert people to the Catholic faith.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could talk a little bit about the special place the rosary has when it comes to the apparitions.
Sure. So, talking about Leo the 13th, one of his many nicknames was the Rosary Pope because he had written several encyclicals to encourage praying the Rosary. He also, Leo the 13th is one of my favorites, so pardon me if I go on too long about him, but he also very much encouraged devotion to Saint Joseph. We're here at the end of the year of Saint Joseph,
Hmm.
and he encouraged, called him the universal patriarch, put out encyclicals to make him one of the great patrons of the church. But the rosary was something that he encouraged in everyone, believing it would be the thing that would save the world. This was something that was echoed in Fatima, of course, where Fatima, Our Lady, introduced us to a new prayer that many of us still recite. It's the prayer where we say, it ends with lead all souls to heaven, especially those in most need of your mercy.
Hmm.
uh, it's a prayer specifically to save the world, literally and spiritually. uh, and this is something that again and again happens. Our Lady of Baunau, Belgium, where she revealed, among other things, a desire for us to keep praying the rosary.
Hmm.
We talked about Rome City, which was a special devotion to Sister Mary Nazarene. And and then, of course, one of the more interesting visions that Padre Pio had, his Laughing Madonna.
Yeah.
Padre Pio encouraged everyone to pray the rosary, believing it was the prayer to help save souls, but also to help save the world. And so we get it again and again that this one special tool of prayer that's been with us since the early medieval ages keeps coming back again and again as a refuge, as a comfort, but also as a really effective tool, something we can do as the faithful to see that our friends, our neighbors are saved
Hmm.
from the terrors of the world, but also the terrors of the afterlife.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's so true. And as you mentioned Padre Pio as I was thinking
Yes.
about him. It's really great, the synergy that's happening here. But one great anecdotal rosary story I have of Padre Pio was that
Yeah.
they say, it's said that he prayed the rosary constantly, and as he was
Mm-hmm.
had gone to bed one evening, he said to the person who was assisting him, "Could you reach into my robe and grab my weapon?" And the the young priest said, What are you?" And he went in and he looked and he said, "There's no weapon in here. All there is your rosary." And he said, "Well, what do you think it is?" So I really just like that story. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we're talking about saints and popes, and of course we've mentioned Fatima, where Our Lady, you know, revealed herself to these poor children, and there have been many children who've had these apparitions. Can you talk
Mm-hmm.
about the fact that they're often experienced by children, and what your sense of that is?
Yeah, actually, I think this is a very seasonal reflection, but when we look at the infancy narrative of Christ, of course, the angels are appearing to Mary, they're appearing to Elizabeth and Joseph to tell them of this great event happening. But the incredible announcement, with all the host of angels and all their glory and their songs, they appear to who else but shepherds hanging out in the out on the sides of civilization.
Right.
Uh, I think there's something to this. G.K. Chesterton, a great Catholic of the 20th century, talked about, like, when we talk about traditions and handing on of things, one of the things we noticed is it tends to come from the sides of our culture, because all of us, people like me who live in big cities, we tend to be more trendy. We tend to be going on to the next thing.
Right.
But the things that we need to hang on to are going to come from more rural, more rustic areas. And I think especially to children, this is true, where being a kid is scary. Being a kid is a terrifying experience. All the adults kind of seem to know what they're doing, but then there's that realization. I know for me, it was about 11 years old where I realized, oh, wait, the adults don't have all the answers like I thought they did. That's even scarier.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Mary coming to them, and and in these cases, they don't have to have the arguments you and I would have. They don't have to have the arguments in their head of like, well, am I actually hearing this? Am I actually seeing this?
Mm-hmm.
They're coming to the children who are already learning about this, already eager to find a strong and loving adult presence in their life. And they're bringing the best adult presence you could have, a mother who is a mother of all your life from your death until your afterlife. And we go back to the shepherds for the infancy narrative, and I think it's because God really does want the poor, the outcast. He wants the people who are in most need of his mercy to hear him first. And through that, it can often be the shepherd children of Fatima, or it can be a sweet teenage girl at Lourdes, Bernadette. And what we find in all these cases is, unlike, even as much as I want to think of myself as a good, faithful Roman Catholic, I think if Mary gave me a mission, I would just doubt the entire time and question the entire time. But you don't see that in these children, especially the Fatima children. They were ready and willing and faced most of their obstacles from the other adults around them.
Yeah. Yeah, that theme of obedience does come through. And, you mentioned something really important because in this modern world we live in, we really live in an age of proof, of video evidence, of
Mm-hmm.
photographic evidence. And as I went through the book, I was like, there is mountains of proof in this book. I mean, this is a 400-page book of proof.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about, I mean, the fact that the visions in Cairo, or the apparitions in Cairo, were
Mm-hmm.
were televised. Tens of
Yes.
thousands of people saw that. But with all of that, or I'll just put out this other number. 75,000 people at Fatima saw the miracle of the sun. That is not any kind of a small number of people. That's a football stadium full of people who
Mm-hmm.
witnessed miraculous events. Yet they still seem obscure, and they've been, sort of pushed aside or uh, taken as folklore.
Right.
Why do you think there's still so much doubt about this stuff?
That's a question I have. Like, when I was first learning about those apparitions in Cairo, uh, they're significant because the church Mary was appearing at Cairo was said to have been built over the house where Joseph had kept the Holy Family when they had to run from Herod. Because as we know from the Gospels, they fled to Egypt for a while and then
Right.
came back eventually. So it had always been historically thought that this church had been built over the place. It was protected when Islam took over, even by the modern, somewhat secular Egyptian government. That church was protected as an important Christian shrine. So Mary showing up there was already a big deal, because it was almost as if to give approval and at least announce, yes, you have the right spot. But as you pointed out, it was televised. And Egypt wasn't a pro-Marian country by any means. So you had, members from the mosque, you had people from the secular government and secular observers coming all over. and they could see this bright shining light of Mary up on the church's tower, just there for the world to see. You can find pictures on Wikimedia Commons and video evidence of it.
Hmm.
And I think what it comes down to, like when I wonder, like, what more do you all need? What more, like if Mary calls you on the phone, would that be enough? And I thought, well, maybe not, because I think there's something to it, that the idea alone that there's something powerful like Mary working through God's power to help change history is already a lot to take in. A lot of us want to think we control our own destinies, that we're fully in control of our society. We can make the weather what we want it to be. We can make the economy what we want it to be. We're eventually going to build robots to do all our jobs. We want to think we have it all under control. And when you read the history of the 20th century, you realize very quickly all of that could have ended so many times through so many little accidents. I think there's a little bit of fear in acknowledging, if there is a God, if there's something all powerful that keeps us preserved, that's a lot more to take in. But the big fear I think for all of us to have in our pride is, that means I'm not in control. That means I'm not the one who decides each and every moment of our fate, which
Yeah.
is a scary truth to have to take in and observe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. I mean, even just going back to the Egyptian apparition, they were so
Mhm.
convinced that it might have been fake. They literally cut power for about a two
Yeah.
square mile area around the church, and the apparition persisted. And, as I was looking through another apparition site in Paso, Italy, 150,000 people witnessed apparitions there to a gentleman named Rosario Toscano, and
Mhm.
he'd been healed. I have to include this quote because
Please.
after he was healed by the Blessed Virgin Mary, he heard these words: "Suffering is thorns, but if they are offered to Jesus, they become roses." And I just want to highlight that because this is what this book is kind of filled with, these complete and beautiful gems that awaken us to the real beauty of what we're talking about here. And I just want to
Mhm.
go to that for a moment because we
Yeah.
hear so much, and many of the accounts are the people talking about this incredible beauty, an undescribable beauty. Um, what strikes you as you look through this book and through these miracles?
Oh, well, El Paso, again, I love how you brought that up. I was thinking about, in particular, that one is delightful because it has a New Testament quality to it. Toscano's was being attended to by a woman, and he even asked her who she was, and she said something to the effect of, I'll tell you when it's time. And eventually, a few days later, she tells him, I'm Mary, the mother of God in the Immaculate Conception. This is something that happens in the Old Testament, especially. Most famously, Raphael appeared in disguise to Tobit and his son Tobias,
Hmm.
and didn't reveal that he was an archangel till much later in the story. And St. Paul tells us in Hebrews to entertain strangers, for some have unknowingly entertained angels. It's that reminder that God can answer prayers in the weirdest of ways, even through strangers, and those strangers might in fact be Mary or the angels, something that is coming into your life and interceding right there. In other words, your life is known, your life is cared about, and you're important to God.
Yeah.
This great, the being of all being, where it all starts, you're important to him. He didn't have to create you out of necessity. As we say in the Catholic Church, he created you purely out of love. And these little incidences where Mary shows up and doesn't even need the attention at first is such a reminder that, again, is something I keep coming back to, but that we're not alone. We're not just made. God isn't the great watchmaker who made us and left us alone to see what we would do. He still intercedes and is trying to bring us to our proper end.
Yeah. That's so true. There's a great story. I just love this story of how Our Lady turned a would-be papal assassination attempt into an incredible blessing and the miracle that happened in Tre Fontane.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember the assassination story. I'm so
Oh,
sorry,
so
but was
this
that the?
gentleman had actually created the knife that he was going to assassinate the
That's
Pope with,
right.
and Our Blessed Lady appeared to him and said, and he had engraved the name and the date that he was going to do it onto this knife that he was going to assassinate the Pope with.
Hmm.
And Our Lady appeared to him. He converted and eventually met the Pope and handed him the knife that he was had created to assassinate him with. He ended up
That's
and
right.
having an
Yeah.
audience with the Pope, and the Pope accepted uh, this gift, which this gentleman, before his conversion, had been crafting in order to assassinate the Pope.
Right. And I do suddenly remember that part. I mean, there's so many little stories here. Sometimes they
Yeah,
get
yeah, no,
mixed up. But and the fact that it happened at Tre Fontane is especially miraculous because that's the abbey that was built over the site where the Apostle Paul was beheaded. And we just think about like who else better to represent the impossible conversion than Paul, the man who was on his way to persecute Christians before being knocked off his horse and having Jesus himself revealed to him.
right.
You know, an impossible, uh, a conversion that is so impossible the other apostles couldn't believe it and had doubts about it. And that's exactly what we see here is there's a man who was ready to carry out an assassination after being influenced by German Protestant and German uh, propaganda for so long. And what he gets converted by again such an impossible encounter, meaning that his heart was ready to be changed. He just needed that little push. And I just think the shadow, but of doing that in the shadow of St. Paul to me is one of the coolest things ever because
Yeah,
it's again showing the continuation of God's history.
yeah. There's so much. St. Paul is then becomes responsible for almost half of the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, there's so much. I mean, there's another thing I wanted to talk about, and uh, well, I'm gonna just read this quote from Adam Bly at the
Please.
opening of the book, and I think it just takes us into w- the next section here, which is here's the quote: "The Christian story is not over. We cannot sit back and just wait for heaven to be handed to us. We must struggle and fight the good fight. The Marian messages are repeated warnings and encouragement to make the right choices, to win the prize, and to attain the joys of everlasting life." That's Adam Bly, the author of The Catholic Guide to Miracles. And as I was reading through this book, this theme began to emerge, and a personal thought also that our Blessed Lady is not only loving, kind, merciful, but she's a real warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking specifically about Lebanon, where she literally intercedes to stop bombs, and but also Poland, where she appeared on the battlefield. Um,
Mm-hmm.
can you talk about those miracles, that those where she's
Absolutely.
assisting in battle?
Yeah. So she again, this is something you see in Christian history again and again, even in the 20th century. One of the most famous odd apparitions to happen in battle during World War One, many English soldiers swore when they had to retreat from Belgium against the German onslaught, they saw that they were being guided and helped by an angel, which they called the Angel of Belgium. Whether they knew the Catholic doctrine of, that cities and nations get their guardian angels and have someone to watch over them or not, I don't know. But a lot of people saw this angel, including most of them not Catholic or even religious per se, but they saw an angel guiding them and moving them uh, from danger. And this was something you could find happen a couple times throughout uh, Christian history. Lebanon, this was in, gosh, is it Deir al-Mar, I believe was the town's
Yes,
name?
I believe that's it.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but this was in the 1970s, and anyone who has either the memory of the 70s or just knows a little bit about 20th century politics, Lebanon was undergoing a very violent civil conflict during the 70s. They were invaded by Syria multiple times. There were various militias, various factions, some of which still exist to this day. If you had a religion or an ethnicity, it meant you probably had a militia patrolling your neighborhood. And in the midst of this was a probably one of the most ancient Catholic communities up in the mountains, the Maronite Catholics. They are this children of Saint Marian, who was a monk who brought the faith up there, and they were left alone because of the mountains in many ways, but they were a rediscovered Catholic group later on during the Crusades. But they are one of the oldest Eastern Rite churches that has never left the papacy, has never had any schism or anything like that. And up in there, among the Marian apparitions I was given to this group over many years, we get this again and again, was a promise from Mary that she would even protect them from the war if they could continue in prayer. This was something that the bishop had heard about as well, Bishop Zogby, who's an interesting figure of the 20th century in the Middle East as well. But they describe a miraculous incident where in January of 76, there were Muslim Palestinian fighters coming in with weaponry, small arms, and they were going to be destroying the monastery in the Maronite settlement. They had time to pray, and the monks, of course, got everyone to prayer. And what do they see when they're in their most desperate time but a woman who came into the vicinity? And when they finally were asking, who the heck are you, she said, be not afraid, I am the Virgin Mary, and I have been here deflecting shells and protecting you from the armaments that are being fired upon you. Tell everyone that they will be okay and that I won't let anyone have anything happen, which is exactly what you want to hear from Mary when you're being fired at by Muslim extremists during a
Yeah.
civil war.
Right.
And it was true to her word, true exactly to her word, that she was going uh, to guard them. And it was among those things. There's a Latin phrase that the author put in here of "show yourself a mother." In other words, show yourself to be a mother to me.
Mhm.
Something John Paul II also encouraged people to pray to Mary, and she showed herself to be a mother not only in wrapping up our wounds, but even protecting us from those who wish to cause us physical harm.
Yeah. Yeah, I just can't emphasize enough the book, physical book. It's a hardcover book,
Oh yeah.
and it's just a substantial volume. It's beautifully illustrated,
Mm-hmm.
and it's designed to be taken in small pieces and just to be sort of open to a page and read about another miracle. So I guess what I would love to get from you just as we close is, um, what are the main messages or what experience would you like people to take away from this book?
Well, as you said, what I really love about this book is, of course, the beautiful art that shows itself throughout. There's some beautiful photographs. There's art from across Christian centuries, going from icons even to the 20th century statues we have. In many ways, I don't know if people even use coffee table books anymore. I love them still, but it acts as a little bit of a coffee table book that also shows you a wider story by just giving you 2 or 3 pages in each story. And I hope what people get out of this more than anything is that this is just the last 200 years of Marian apparitions. it, if they learn nothing else, I hope they learn that God isn't leaving them alone, that they have an advocate, that Mary does hear their prayers and Mary does intercede on their behalf. And that ultimately, especially in these very strange times where it can seem chaotic, and I don't know what's going to happen on the news from day to day in the United States, but we're not just left to the chaos. Mary is still here. She is advocating for us. And if you continue praying and if you continue hoping, there's a good chance that Mary is going to intercede for our country and to save the world that is ours.
Michael, I can't agree with you more than that. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time today to share so much beauty about this volume. And let's just remind people, if they're so inclined, to pick up the rosary and pray the rosary every day. It's really not a huge commitment, but it is a rewarding one. So I just would really like to thank you for taking the time to be here on the program today and to share so many wonderful insights and to remind us that miracles continue to exist.
And thank you, David. I always love talking about these subjects. I can go on and on forever about a few of them, but thank you for letting me share.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play Music, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And visit our website at thefocusingway.com.